and welcome everyone to the project tonight. This is the part where normally one of us pastors would speak and do like a message. We want to switch it up a little bit this week, and I'm actually really excited for this because we're kind of closing off our Heroes and Zeros series that we've been doing for the whole month of July, going through different characters in the Bible, different people in the Bible that kind of started off, or either they were kind of the negative story, they were the people that made the big mistake, or they were the people that were really heroes, and hence the series title, Heroes and Zeros. And I'll be honest with you, I was looking at this message a couple of weeks ago and wanted to kind of end with a little bit of a story where there's both and. Had this idea of where I wanted to go with the message, and realized there was a real opportunity that was gonna come up for somebody that I'm good friends with to kind of be able to mirror the same story as the message I was looking for, and I'll get to that in a little bit. But we're gonna do a bit of an interview with one of my best friends, and his name's Matt Kofler. Matt, you can wave to the people. Hi, Matt.
Hi.
So, Matt's here. And so it's just exciting for me to have him here. I'm not gonna tell his story for him. We're gonna do an interview style. He's telling a really honest part of his life. And that's not always easy. I think it's one of the first times he's ever done that in public, so I'm really thankful that he's here and willing to put himself out there. But my experience with Matt actually was I got to know him when he was a youth leader here at this church, when he was actually attending the project. And I coached him at my last job. I was a leadership development coach for pastors, and I was coaching him. And over the last year or two, we actually just became very, very good friends. And so I know a little bit of his story, and I know his heart. He's a guy that absolutely loves Jesus, loves to see youth and young people and just people in general take that next step or take their relationship with Jesus to another level. And I really believe for people here today that his story is gonna connect with literally anyone here, but I know that you're gonna find hope, and you're gonna find truth, and you're gonna find hope in general from what Matt's story is. But we're gonna do an interview style. It's a lot to take on to just go out there and speak, but this is Matt's story, not mine. So I'm gonna start off, Matt, first of all, welcome. Glad you're here, like we said.
Thanks.
I just want to start to say, like, just explain kind of who you are and how you got here, why I asked you to come.
Yeah, as to like, I guess who I am, like Jeff kind of shared, my name's Matt. I'm a youth pastor, just a small church down, just like in Millbourne area. It's called City South Church. I've been there for about 5 years. I was part-time for a little while. It was kind of my first year in full-time ministry. But I've known, like Jeff mentioned, for many years since I was like literally here at the project. But actually, this is the cool little part about this too, is like this is also where I met my wife. So just want to let you guys know there's hope. Just saying.
Don't overpromise.
I can't overpromise, but I'm just saying it's there, right? But so Jeff's known me for the better part of the 5 years. I actually kind of put together a couple of pictures there. My wife, actually, when I met her here, her name's Kate. This is my wife, Kate, and my little 1-year-old, his name's Kit. And basically, we got to celebrate having Kit over this past year. Kate went to this church her whole life, and I came and disrupted her life. But the funny thing is a little fact about Jeff, he was one of the first 3 people that helped my baby when I came home from the hospital. So Jeff's a little bit of a softie. Yeah, you can throw that other picture up there if you'd like. Jeff thinks that he's also my dog's best friend. He jokes and says he's gonna come over and play with my dog, but literally, he's a little bit excited to come see the kid. And it's just been it's been a crazy, wild year just kind of getting to know Jeff. But kind of like why he brought me here is just I get an opportunity to kind of share with you guys that like how God really kind of impacted me literally here in this community, literally to like, you know, just beside the sound booth there. I used to be in that exact back row, and I used to park my car right out there, and I would like drive in, come in, sit for the service, and peel out of here. It was just a weird season of my life, but before I kind of dive into that, I just want to share with you guys something really cool that like God kind of impressed. When Jeff asked me to speak about this, I was like, I'm gonna tear up a couple times through this just because it's just like God really pushed upon me many years ago, as far back as 8 years ago. I was sitting in that back row, and it was kind of weird. If you guys ever seen those like war movies where like a bomb goes off and there's like that weird ear ringing kind of thing, it was the first time I heard God's voice, I think, sitting here in the project. And as I was sitting in that back row, I just remember God saying, one day you're going to tell your story. And he specifically meant from this stage. And that was over 8 years ago. And I thought, there's no way. I'm never going to be up here. I'm never going to want to talk in front of this many people. I'm from a fairly small church. My youth group is a small church. Like, I'm used to the more conversationalist thing. And this was like way out of my comfort zone. But it was just super cool when you asked me. And it was just more than a blessing to come here and share with you. But kind of how I ended up at the project, it's just been a whole process, I'd say. About 10 years ago, I came from Ontario. Do you have any other Ontario migrants in the room at all? Yeah? Got a couple? Yeah, so I was in Ontario when the first recession kind of hit, grew up out there, small farming community, and after my first kind of crack at college, I kind of failed out of college, and I was like, didn't really know what to do with my life. I had enough schooling to be a diesel mechanic, and I looked for apprenticeships, but work was really hard. I was working in an auto parts factory, essentially, and being a part of that factory, it was just mind-numbing because I was working for like a temp agency, earning like $10 an hour, and I'm not exaggerating. It was like $10 an hour. It was that bad, and we heard like whispers of Albertan currency that was like $18 an hour, and that's when we were like, we gotta go. We just thought we had to go. Like, if you ever feel like you have an inadequate job, just remember at one point I was putting signal lights in BMW like light housings, so we know that they don't get used, but like we're still putting them in there. It was just like, yeah, I fell apart.
Someone really liked that one. I don't even understand it.
Yeah, you've lived in Millwoods, you know that BMWs cut you off all the time. So you know that, but still, when I eventually made it out here, I gotta also preface this a little bit. When I was in that space in my life in Ontario, I was already starting the peaks of like, we call it in Ontario, we call them degens or degenerates. I was already kind of smoking weed, drinking, pushing boundaries, and in order to like feed my own addictions in that sense and already being hard up for money, I had to dabble, and I've kind of coined this term. I was a street pharmacist, if you would. I know we kind of laugh about it now, but it was like, just the thing I was doing just to feed kind of my addiction at that point. And I was just really in this stagnant position. So me and a couple buddies, we just decided we were gonna load up and just head out to Alberta, and we were gonna go to the promised land with oil and money. That's what we thought was out here.
Yeah, you might have missed the boat on that one.
Definitely missed the boat because I did not get a job in the oil patch or anything like that. I was working construction when I first came out here. Just any job you could get. But I was still making like $18 an hour back then, and I thought like in Ontario, that was like, oh man, I can get a jacked up truck on payments, and like I was in the upper echelon class back then. Like that was the goal. You get a jacked up truck, you go back home, and like that was it. That was the goal in life. But I soon learned that there was more to life than that. Because when I first came here, it was like a huge wake up call about like how like paying bills. I knew none of these things. I grew up on a family acreage my whole life, and I was able to just like be catered to essentially. And I grew up in a fairly good house, and I had no excuses for the behavior that was kind of happening. And again, I didn't want to admit defeat, didn't want to go home and struggle. There's a lot of my buddies that moved out here, and they ended up going back home. And essentially, I was just kind of stuck, and I was like, what do I do? I had like a house I was paying for, bills I was paying for, and I was stuck. So I was falling back on my trade there with street pharmaceutical industries, I'd say, and I ended up pushing myself kind of deeper into that world. And what I found myself is that I was starting to get involved with heavier drugs. I was starting to get involved with like bigger organizations, if you will, and I was just really going into this deep rabbit hole. But around, I'd say about 2014 was when God kind of started intervening in my life, and it wasn't a pleasant intervention, I'd say. I've shared this with Jeff a few times. We've both been in these boats before. We've shared kind of these moments that changed our lives, but in 2014, after a July-long weekend, my dad had passed away of a heart attack in his sleep. And I can't express to you how good of a dad I had. He was my world. He was my soccer coach growing up. He was the person you'd call when you needed things. I know we all have those people in our lives that we we lean on, and we know that they're always gonna be there. So my dad put my family on its back, and we were immigrants from South Africa originally, and we've kind of fought for everything we could to make it in this country. And I know I don't sound like I'm from there anymore, but
When you talk to your mom on the phone, it comes out. I've heard it.
yeah, the little bit of accent sneaks out, right? But still, my parents were my world, and to see my mom that broken and devastated, as well as like having that one person in your life that you were like you always thought was gonna be there, and the beauty, like the beauty and also the pain in that, it was just like recognizing that a death of a person greatly affected change in my life, whether it hurt or not. And I was in that moment, I just was devastated. And what I kind of spiraled into this lifestyle of, I wanted drugs to numb the pain. I really hit rock bottom about December 2014 that year. And actually, again, I sent Jeff another picture. Basically, where I had hit rock bottom, I was nothing but like skin and bones. I don't know if we have that available. So this is me, 2015. Just to give you a bit of contrast, I'm like a 230 guy on a regular basis. I was like 110 pounds, soaking wet. You could see my ribs. I had no health in my life. I was truly falling apart. And when we went to go basically bury my dad and put my dad to rest in South Africa, that was probably one of the very few moments where I had been sober in the past 5 years and had to like actually feel what was happening and going on in my life. And again, this pain kept overcoming me. I was angry at God. I was angry at everything, because I grew up in a good home. My parents took us to church occasionally, and then my mom eventually got called into ministry, and so I was raised in what I thought was like a healthy home. There was no excuse for this behavior, but again, I just kind of leaned into that, and I wanted the pain to stop. I wanted to do my own thing. I didn't think I had to live by this like weird rules and circumstances. And it all came kind of, I don't know how to really put it, but there was a point in my life where it's like, it all comes together, and it just like, you can only get away with this for so long. And so coming to like the winter end of that, just after December, I was making a product run for this organization that I was a part of to Kelowna. And I had spent this weekend partying and everything, and I dropped off this stuff, and then basically I was coming back, made a pit stop in like Kamloops, Thompson Rivers University, where, funny enough, where I met somebody else who crossed paths with me that's now a pastor as well. It's weird how God has those like little circumstances, and we've shared coincidences and like things.
It wasn't me.
Yeah, it wasn't Jeff, I assure you. But it was just really weird how God puts us in those crossroads. But I was just about an hour outside of Kamloops, and probably the worst thing that you could experience if you're somebody who's in that life is you see like police lights in your rear view. And I was shook, and I was like panicking as I was pulling over, because I knew I'd done drugs recently. And I was like, this is it, my world's over. But the funniest thing, and this is like not something to really sneeze at, but as I'm sitting there in my car and I watch this cop walk up to me, because I was like, I know how this ends in the back of my head. I know how this comes to fruition. I wasn't thinking about prison. I'm a dual citizen, and I don't know why I thought this at the time, but I didn't think about deportation, but it like snuck in the back of my head. I was like, they're gonna send me to South Africa. South African jail's worse than Canadian jail. Like, I was like, this is gonna be so bad. But those thoughts weren't coming to my head. The first thing that came to it was like, what if they call my mom? Like, I'm serious. Like, I was like, what if they call, like, I was like a 21-year-old male at this time, and I'm just like, why would they call my mom?
Man, they must make moms different in South Africa, because that wouldn't have been my thought for sure.
Yeah, listen, like, if you ever piss off a South African parent, man, like, you run. Like, you book tickets, you leave, right? So my mom, she uses the term, it's hartblaksem. It means I'm gonna hit you so hard you're dead. Like, hartblaksem, right? So if you ever have kids one day, you can learn that. I say it to my dog. Can't say it to my kid yet. He hasn't done anything. So he's still trying to figure out how to walk and even speak words. So he's innocent for now. I'm just worried he turns out like me a little bit, talks back. So, but still, I remember after all this happened, the cop kind of leans in. He said it to me. He's like, hey, you get out, like you're under arrest for controlled substance. Like he just stuck his head in and he could just smell my car. And I was like, I'm done. But like, I was like, what? And he like said it very aggressive. He's like, get out of the car. You're under arrest. And I was like, I still couldn't process it. Again, there was like that, almost that PTSD feeling. And still in the back of my head, I was like, this dude's gonna call my mom. Like, he's gonna do it. He knows her number, right? But sure enough, like they searched my vehicle. They found like 2 grams of something. And they're like, this isn't even worth our time. They did like a roadside sobriety test. By like God's grace, somehow I miraculously passed it. And I only got off with like a 24-hour suspension. But I remember standing on the side of the road, and there's this RCMP officer who like had weird kind of images of like my dad almost, like lecturing me up and down, like the dangers of drug use, everything. He literally had no idea what I had just done like 4 hours back down the road and like what my life was at. And he was just like leaning into me. And the funny thing is they impound your car for the 24 hours, and I'm sitting in the tow truck driver, and this tow truck driver's like, yeah, that guy's like a sergeant. He gets sent down to the States, and he does all kinds of investigations on mass like organized crimes and everything. And I was like, I got off lucky, like more than I deserve. But after that point in my life, I soon realized that like I was having this weird, I'd say heart change was kind of what was happening. Every time I try to party with my friends at that point, or even like try to be in these situations, in these circumstances, I had panic attacks. I had to go to the hospital a couple times. I just had this like, I couldn't even use drugs anymore to suppress the pain. Like it came to the point where it was like, didn't matter what I did or what I used. I couldn't feel anymore, and I wasn't even able to suppress the pain. It was like kind of like almost, I think about it now, and it's weird when you say it out loud, but it's like I feel like God was kind of even like taking the taste of that out of me, being like, you can't even hide from your pain anymore. And I was like, shoot, like what do I do? And I lived in this house with about 4 Newfie guys at the time. God bless them. I love Newfoundlanders. They'll give the shirt off your back. I haven't met one of them that isn't just like salt of the earth, literally. Not just because they eat salt beef by the bucket load, but just because they're just genuine great humans. Like they were great guys, and yes, we did some stupid things together, but I just remember sitting there in that basement and just being like, I can't do this anymore. And I ended up breaking down, and then I called my mom. I did the one thing I probably feared the most, and like...
It sounds like you feared your mom quite a bit.
She's gonna watch this later and just be like, you better. Like, she had that saying where it's like, I brought you into this world, I can take you out, and I believed it. There was like situations as a teenager where you'd like push your mom to the brink, and you'd be like, you can't hit me, I'll call child services. She's like, I'll dial the number. And I'm like, just like, she'd call you out right away, and it's like, oh man. And see, and that's the thing, I was also so afraid of hurting that woman, so much so. Like, I didn't want to see her suffer like she did when my dad had left us, and not by his choice. And it sucks because he's missing out on these moments of like turning points and kind of how God intervened in that moment. But she eventually sent my sister out to me. I had to reset my life. I ended up getting a basement suite, and I'm not even kidding. It's like 2 blocks behind this church. And it was just, again, there's weird little steps and circumstances that I feel like God kind of always had this like hand in my life. And it's just things that lined up that just didn't make sense that were happening. And I was like, I didn't recognize it at the time. I didn't even recognize it until Jeff told me I gotta put this pen to paper and we gotta write this out. He didn't force me to do this, by the way, but it was just like, he really had to coach me into like saying, you know what, like, dude, you gotta celebrate this story, because it's not about what happened to me in this situation. It's just the continual reminder of how Jesus like redeemed this life, thinking I was so far gone, but yet he was giving me opportunities, like little windows, I would say, to like have success in it. And I just remember my sister came for that weekend, and she like had basically 2 demands. One, I got to do all my laundry because it had been like weeks and it was disgusting. And secondly, she was like, that Sunday we were going to church. and she laid out like a list of options, and this was one of the churches, and I figured this is close. I'll go, I'll get it done, I'll never have to come back, because like I had no desire to want to be in a church ever again. Like growing up, our church was not like this, right? Growing up, we had like a single kind of schoolroom church. We had old lady Muriel on the keys playing hymns, and I was like, I'm not going to church. Like I just didn't want to do it. I was like, this is dumb. And sure enough, we walk in here. I wore my best plaid because that's all I had. That was like, I thought you had to like dress up a little bit. So I put on my only good Levi's and plaid and rolled in here. And funny enough, there's a pastor. It's like when you walk in here on a Sunday morning, it's like they can smell that you're new. This guy waddled right up to us, and I literally mean waddled like right up to us. And he's like, "Hi, new here?" And I was like, "Yep." And it was just awkward, and I didn't want to be there. And like I probably still smelt like my first morning cigarette kind of thing. And I was just like, I was just not having it. And funny enough, we sat there, and like it was when Phil was just kind of starting out here as like the senior pastor.
Phil used to have my position like 10 years ago. Now he's the lead pastor of Hope City.
No, this is when he was an associate even.
Oh,
this
okay.
was before I even came to the project. This was like Sunday morning thinking.
I'm old. Time is just one big warp at this point.
And I was like, okay, this guy's kind of like, he spoke some cool stuff. It was nothing like I had experienced church before. There was more than one instrument on the stage. It was different. But sure enough, as we're walking out the doors, that guy that found us, again, waddled up to us, "Hi." And we're like, this guy, man. He's like, "I want you to meet somebody." And so he brings me over, and at the time, Thomas, he's the next gen pastor here now. He was the lead for the project. He was in Jeff's position. And he basically shook my hand, handed me this like CD case with like pastor backstories, biographies. And I was like, again, this was all weird to me and new. I was like, why do I need to know this guy's favorite color and this kind of stuff? It was just like, I didn't understand the culture or any of it. And I was like, okay. And he's like, yeah, we got a young adult service. It happens here every Sunday on 7 p.m. My sister's like, sweet, we'll be there. And I was like, church twice in one day? Like, are you kidding me? So, but then when I came here, there's three other pastors that were on staff before as well, and the guy that was on here was hilarious at the time, and it was just like, not that Jeff's ever funny, right? Like, gotta take my jabs when I can, but so, but I was in this feeling like this isn't what church is like, and it was different. And sure enough, as soon as I attended once, my sister's calling me. Couple weeks later, I dragged my feet, came back here Sunday night. I was like, I could do Sunday night church. Sunday morning church, I wasn't having it. But like Sunday night, you can like reason with it a little bit.
Yeah, you get to sleep till noon.
Yeah, I was like, it's all right. It's not that bad, but still, I was like leaning into this. And again, this guy, Thomas, that the Waddler guy came up and introduced me. I was just like, he kept like texting me, talking to me, said, hey, would love to connect with you, go for coffee. And I was like, sure. And sure enough, the guy just genuinely wanted to talk, genuinely wanted to hear who I was and what was going on. I was still, again, sitting in the back there, kind of peeling out of here. And I was really stagnant. But the change that kind of happened was I had that moment when I was just sitting there, and I remember it was Pastor David at the time, and he was just like, just pray for God to just dream big things. And I had that moment where God's like, you're gonna share one day. And I was like, there's no way. I didn't even have a desire to be a pastor. I was working for like a mobile crane operation then, for a drywall company. I had a good job, good kind of like benefits. I hit like the boomer, trifecta of having a job, had a pension, a paycheck, and I could have some money to spend, right? I was like, why do I want anything more of this life? And then it was just those little pushes that came around that was like, you want to do more. You have to do more. And it was one night after the project, I remember I got pushed out of my comfort zone because my favorite seat was taken, and it was on we all know you guys all hold sacred cows on your seats, don't pretend. It's like, you're like, why is this guy in my seat? There's no assigned seating, but why is this guy in my seat? But it was kind of like in this back corner here, and I like to kind of coin it as that's where the veteran project attendees used to be. And that's when I met probably some of some lifelong friends there, and I was like, it was just nuts. And I had this awkward guy named Doug, who's now like my neighbor, and my wife is best friends with his wife, and we hang out quite a bit. And this guy, Doug, had like a box of board games in his car, right? Not used to what I'm seeing in a trunk from my typical past life, right? You know, guy had a box of board games in the back of his car, and they all ended up in my basement suite one night. And these guys really taught me like what community really meant. And I just remember there was that heart change. Like, you know, I didn't have taste much for alcohol anymore. I didn't have the desire to want to smoke as much. I just slowly little things started changing. And then Thomas pushed me. He said, you know what would be really healthy for you is taking a moment and kind of grounding your faith. And I was like, well, what does that even mean? And he's like, well, some people do like YWAM, or they do these one-year programs. At the time, Vanguard's the local Bible college, and there was a youth program. They did a trip to New York every year, and I was like, okay, that sounds like something, a pill to swallow. And little did I know that was like the tipping point that I needed, that kind of rolled me into ministry. And from coming to the project weekly, getting involved with youth hanging out here as well. It's funny, I even saw one of the youth from my small group, Graydon, playing guitar. I remember when that guy was just a little junior high, you know, used to make really bad jokes about Mario Kart all the time. But it's just like...
Still does.
He still does? Okay, nothing's changed. But it's like, and I remember I even got to watch him graduate Vanguard. It was just like, just these cool moments where God kind of lined everything up for like, almost like setting it up like a t-ball batter, and I could just swing. That's all I had to do was just grab the bat and swing. But it still required work, because what we don't talk about is the fact that I was just probably the worst human ever for like a good chunk of my life. I was doing anything for money, selling whatever I could get my hands on. I stole, I cheated, and I was just like, why am I redeemable? What makes Matt Kofler so special? And I carried that guilt for a long time, and I still carry a bit of it continually, because I still think about like selling to people that don't need to buy drugs, or knowing the fact that I had a hand in probably ruining people's lives. And now I'm expected to kind of switch sides and tell people that Jesus is the end. I couldn't do it. And it's funny enough, right around that time where I was starting to struggle with that guilt, and I was a bit bitter because, one, God had taken away that one person in my life that I thought was so important to me, my dad. And then at the other time, I wasn't being successful in ministry. I was being bitter. And it was, oddly enough, that's when Jeff kind of came into my life a little bit. I was an intern here for a summer, my second year. And Jeff and I took a long drive out to Alberta Beach because we were setting up for youth camp that week. And he kind of leaned into me a little bit. I will say that lightly, in the sense of like, not like a smarten up kind of comment, but also like God's got purpose in your life, and you're almost wasting this opportunity. I remember I preached on this a couple weeks back with our church, and I learned that like we're battling insurmountable odds even just to exist here. Like, it's a 400 billion to 1 that we exist on this planet. Like, to just be here. And in a moment, I realized that the community that I established from being here at the project, the people that were pushing me from the outside, even the program directors, I even work for one of the former program directors, he's my senior pastor. It's just God put all of these moments in my life, but I had to do the work in it as well. I had to push as well. I had that kind of opportunity, but I had to seize it as well. And that's when I kind of coined, I didn't get a picture in time to Jeff, but I got this tattoo put on my arm right around my wife and I's honeymoon when we first went on honeymoon together. And it's Proverbs 27:17. It's iron sharpens iron like one friend does to another. That became my life verse in a sense of like, one, friendship that I established with Jeff and just the community that I had forged here through pro sports and Doug playing board games. If you get a chance to go to pro sports, I know it still exists. That's the only small group that will never die, right? I met some of my lifelong friends there, guys that are pastors as well now, and just, it was able to build that foundation, but I also had to be willing, right? I had to open up my heart in a sense of leaning into those seasons and owning my part in life and realizing that God had control, but I had to also let control go in that situation. And it wasn't an easy process, but I can't sit there and dwell on the past. There's been sleepless nights where you're like, I've still ruined these people's lives, or I still caused harm to this. There's a huge difference between conviction and guilt. And we were chatting about this before, Jeff and I, and conviction is something the Holy Spirit does to you when you're really feeling it, and he's calling you out on something. Whereas like guilt is not of God. The Holy Spirit wants to lean into you and build into you, but he doesn't want to make you feel guilty and shame for what you've done. Jesus didn't haul that cross up the hill for us to just sit there and just say, oh, well, this is our insurance policy in a sense. He carried it up just as much as you carry it up daily. Like that's the strength Jesus calls us all to. So I guess, yeah.
No, that's great. And I guess the next question I have is like, what was the moment, like, how are you different now? Like, what has changed in your heart and your mind, and how are you processing that in real time now? Like, who is Matt today as a comparison?
So who's Matt today? I'd say as like a comparison, as like I learned now that it's like I have more patience and compassion, especially for like these young adults and these youth. But I've stated a couple times, I had a great dad, and I just have that heart to like be that person in some of my students' lives, not to replace their father figure, never to take the place of that, but also just to have a heart to like, guide and lead people in those manners. Like I want to celebrate your guys' stories and like my youth stories and just people that I interact with, like as a kingdom as we build Jesus together. And that's kind of how my mentality shifted, is just like not trying to just understand that Jesus didn't come into my life just to like, hey, look at what Matt did and everything. My life means nothing without Jesus in it. Redemption doesn't happen without Jesus in it. So,
And I guess to kind of close off this part of the talk, if you could give one piece of advice to whether somebody's here in the same type of seemingly dire or deep or you said irredeemable circumstances, or whether it's just somebody who feels like they're not good enough or that they're irredeemable in some sense, what would be a piece of advice? If you could say one thing to them, what would that be?
You got to lean in. And I know that seems like a very kind of like Christianese speak word, like, the language you use in church a lot, but it's just, people are going to ask you to do things like go for coffee or attend a small group or take those steps. Like if I didn't show up to pro sports, like if I didn't show up or let those people in my house or even just be vulnerable with a friend like Jeff, if you're not vulnerable and just letting those people in, and you have like that closed fist mentality, or it's like, I don't think I can do this, or I've gone too far. Like we learned this with like Saul to Paul, an age-old story in the Bible where it's like the guy was a murderer and destruction of the Christian world and culture, and then he turned out to be the person that wrote like a good percentage of the New Testament. Like Jesus redeems you no matter what. Don't ever think you're in a place where you're too far gone. Because I was in that place too. I was even in that place up until about 6 years ago. And my wife and I still work through these little moments of like, that shame. But we know that constant, that Jesus and that community and that relationship, like God put safeguards in that place. He's protected us now that we can do that. So just lean in, and I wholeheartedly mean that. Go for coffee with that small group leader or that pastor that keeps bugging you or that friend that keeps dragging you to church. Like, just do it.
That's great. Well, thanks, Matt, so much for sharing your story. I know that's not easy, and honestly, like, we did interview Stella because he wasn't sure if he was going to be able to kind of communicate clearly. I think he did a pretty good job communicating, and great job.
Thank you.
Thank you for your honesty. And so just before I kind of close off, if people want to chat after, are you available after, anything like that?
Oh yeah, like I'll be hanging around, so feel free. I'd love to chat with you guys, so yeah.
Awesome. Well, thanks, Matt. Give him a round of applause. It's just so exciting to hear stories like that, because that's really what it's all about. Last week we had baptism, 6 people got baptized, made the decision to stand in front of everyone and say, I'm no longer defined by who I used to be, but I'm now defined by who Jesus says I am. And that's the message of Jesus. That's the hope in the cross. And like Matt alluded to, the original kind of story of the historical event in the Bible that I wanted to talk about was the guy named Paul. And if you've heard of him before, that's great, but if you haven't, he was a Pharisee. He was somebody who was like super religious and was somebody who was trying to snuff out the Christian faith shortly after Jesus had risen from the grave after being crucified. The Christian faith was taking on all this momentum, and he was a Jewish leader, and he saw that as a threat. He was part of a large organized group that said, we need to stop this thing because it needs to get out, it's getting out of control. We have to stop it. And so he actually, in the book of Acts, in the second half of the Bible called the New Testament, he's actually seen standing over the murder of one of Jesus' disciples and kind of giving his approval to it. He was a murderer. He was somebody who had organized these people to hunt down Christians, to throw them in prison, and even worse, to maybe stone them to death, to brutally murder them for their faith. Let's just put it this way. Paul, or his name was Saul at the time, sucked. He was a bad dude. He was as irredeemable as anybody ever could be seen as. In the eyes of the standards of what we would see as sin and truth and justice, the guy didn't stand a chance. He had earned hell. But the story doesn't end there. Because after he kills this guy named Stephen, this disciple, he goes to a place called Damascus. He's on a road there. He's on a horse or donkey or whatever. He's transporting himself there. He's traveling there. And there's this verse in Acts 9, and it says this: as he neared Damascus on his journey, suddenly a light from heaven flashed around him. He fell to the ground and heard a voice say to him, Saul, Saul, why do you persecute me? Who are you, Lord? Saul asked. I am Jesus who you are persecuting, he replied. Now get up and go into the city, and you will be told what you must do. The men traveling with Saul stood there speechless. They heard the sound, but they did not see anyone. Saul got up from the ground, but when he opened his eyes, he could not see nothing. So they led him by the hand into Damascus. For 3 days he was blind and did not eat or drink anything. And from that point, he meets with some Christians, and they're a little skeptical, to say the least. Not really the first person that they're comfortable hanging out with, because he was known, his reputation went before him as somebody who was a bad person, who didn't deserve any grace, who was a monster of a man. But they spent time with him, they prayed for him, they taught him, they mentored him. And over a course of time, not only did he regain his ability to see, but he began to see things differently. He began to know who Jesus was, not this monster, this problem that he needed to snuff out, but this calling, this God, this relationship that he needed to seek out with everything in him. The truth is this: he went on from that point on to be one of the greatest heroes of the Christian faith. We are in a church right now because he planted churches all around the known world at that time. He was a missionary. His letters to different churches are much of the second half of the Bible, the New Testament. He was used by God in ways that you would never be able to imagine. When you see where he was at that moment when God knocked him off his horse or his donkey on the road to Damascus. It would have been preposterous if you would have just shown people, would have seen it without seeing it with their own eyes. They would have been like, this is crazy, not a chance. How did this happen? This has got to be fake, because Paul was bad. And at that point, he would have defined himself as bad, or at least the disciples would have. The truth is, Paul was irredeemable. The truth is, Paul didn't deserve grace. The truth is, he should have just probably been thrown to the wolves, thrown in prison. God should have just smited him and ended him. Paul was worth nothing. We talk about heroes and zeros. Paul, he was named Saul, then became Paul. He was a zero. But in the end of the day, God took somebody, Saul, who was a zero, and turned him into Paul. He just changed his name because it was just a representation of how drastically his life and his person had changed because Jesus stepped in. The same way that Matt talks about, he was in the back and he found that he was completely irredeemable. He wasn't somebody that deserved grace. He thought that he was the lowest of the low, and he still has to kind of wrestle with that in his own mind, in his own heart, and work through that with Jesus. Paul was bad. But I love this verse in Galatians 2. And it actually, this is crazy because Paul is writing this to the Galatians church well after he has this moment. He says, I have been crucified with Christ, and I no longer live, but Christ lives in me. The life I now live in the body, I live by faith in the Son of God, who loved me and gave himself for me. How do you go from chasing down Christians to saying that? To defining yourself that way, that your life is different that much, that you just start going by a totally different name because you're so different than what you were before. And the truth is this for you sitting here today, or you watching online today, or engaging in any way hearing these words, is that I don't care what you think you've done. I don't care what you have done. It could be horrible. You could have hurt people like you've never imagined you could. You could have been a terrible person, whether it's a drug dealer, whether it's an addict, a liar, a thief, your childhood stuff that you had happen to you. You may identify yourself as irredeemable. You need to hear this today. You have so much hope. And don't ever let anyone tell you different. The thought in the back of your head is not talking about me. He's not talking about me. That's someone else. Listen, there is so much hope for you. There's nothing you can do, nothing that Jesus can't redeem. He died on the cross and defeated death, so that thing that you think is completely irredeemable, that makes you not valid, not worthy of grace, not worthy of forgiveness, that you think that you have to end your own life for, you've been contemplating something bad, you're just in depression all the time, you think I'm trapped and I deserve it. I don't deserve anything but what I have. That is a lie and it's not true. Jesus died on a cross, he endured immeasurable pain. Not just for some story so we could do church. He wasn't just doing it for all the masses. He was doing it for you individually. And that's something I have a hard time wrapping my head around sometimes, because if I was told I had to die right now for this entire room, let alone the whole world, I could do it. I wouldn't want to. I can get my head around that to save, a lot of people. But know this, Jesus would have gone through all that pain. He would have gone through all that torture just for you. If it was only you. That's how valuable you are. And don't you ever forget it. So know this, whether we're talking about Matt or we're talking about Saul who became Paul, the opportunity to drastically change your life is in front of you. The hope is right in front of you, but that hope has to be accepted. And that starts with following Jesus, with making the best decision anyone, and you especially, can ever make in your whole life, and that's to follow Christ, to make Jesus Lord of your world, and to follow him and pattern your life after him. It's a long process. We're still working through it. Matt's still working through it. But I promise you, there is no pursuit that is worth more and is more valuable than to chase after a Jesus-based life. And you can do that right now. No matter who you've been, no matter where you've been, it's available to you. So if that's you, I'm not gonna make you do an obstacle course or something up at the front. I'm just gonna ask you to pray this prayer along with me. In your head, in your heart, or out loud, it's up to you. But Jesus, thank you that you are God. I acknowledge that I have sin in my life, that I've contributed to the chaos of the world around me, and I have sin that I need to work through, I need to be forgiven of. I know you died on the cross for my sin so I could be forgiven. And even if I'm struggling to recognize that and reconcile that in my mind and in my heart, I accept it now and I choose you as God of my life, Jesus. Pray that you would make me look, act, and speak more like you. And through that, I look forward to the hope that you offer to me and everyone else. In Jesus' name, amen. So if you made that decision today, make sure you come chat with one of our pastors, or there's a little QR code on the seat back in front of you. You can fill that out. And even if you're just having more questions, maybe you're not ready to land there yet, but you want to know more about this Jesus thing, come talk to us. Go to the QR code. We'd love to chat. In just a second, the band's going to play a couple more songs. And I understand that we're talking about some deep stuff, and you're probably wrestling in your heart with some stuff. Some of you are really fighting this. I want you to just hear the words and see the words in this song. And I'd encourage you to just let go. Open your heart and let Jesus, let the Holy Spirit, let God speak into your life. And where lies have persisted, I promise you, I promise, He will bring truth and He will bring hope. If you're able to, let's stand together.